October 24th, 1944. The waters east of Leyte Gulf. The Philippine archipelago spreads across the horizon like a chain of emeralds and sapphires. The ocean is dark beneath an overcast sky. The transports and supply ships of the American 7th Fleet sit heavy in the water, loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, food, and replacement parts. MacArthur is ashore. The landing at Leyte succeeded beyond anyone's optimistic expectations. American troops have established a beachhead, and the general has already walked into the surf to fulfill his promise. I have returned. But his return means nothing if the transports are sunk by the Japanese Navy. And on this morning, the Japanese Navy is coming. Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid stands aboard his flagship, the USS New Orleans, and contemplates the most difficult decision of his career. He is not a man prone to fear. He has fought in 3 carrier battles. He has commanded cruisers in impossible circumstances, but today he faces a problem that no amount of experience can fully prepare a man for. Somewhere to the north, Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet is steaming away. Halsey believes he is pursuing the main Japanese carrier force. Halsey believes his fleet will destroy it. Halsey believes this is the correct tactical decision. Kincaid, however, is beginning to understand that Halsey may have made a catastrophic mistake. Kincaid is beginning to understand that San Bernardino Strait, the northern entrance to Leyte Gulf, is now undefended, and he is beginning to understand that a massive Japanese force is heading directly toward those undefended waters. The Japanese plan was audacious in its ambition and complex in its execution. Operation Show 1, the Japanese called it, the defense plan. The last great gamble of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese Navy no longer had the advantage it once possessed. The Americans had crushed the Japanese carrier force at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. That battle had been so devastating that American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese had lost over 600 aircraft in a matter of days. The trained carrier pilots could not be replaced. The skill accumulated through years of flying could not be rebuilt in weeks. The Japanese carriers that remained were hollow shells, filled with inexperienced pilots who would never survive combat against the American flyers. The Japanese understood this. The Japanese admirals gathered in Tokyo knew that the age of the aircraft carrier, as the primary instrument of naval warfare, was ending. But the Japanese had built something that the Americans had not: battleships. Massive battleships with guns that could fire shells the size of automobiles. Battleships that represented centuries of naval tradition and culture. The Yamato and the Musashi, the largest battleships ever constructed, 72,000 tons of steel and firepower, 9 18.1-inch guns that could hurl 3,220-pound armor-piercing shells 26 miles. This was the last card the Japanese Navy could play. They would sacrifice everything, the remaining carriers, the cruisers, the destroyers, all of it, to get these battleships into Leyte Gulf. If the battleships reached the beaches, they could bombard the transports. They could sink enough of MacArthur's invasion fleet to force him to withdraw. They could buy Japan time. They could slow the American advance across the Pacific. This was the grand strategy, and it was coordinated with an elaborate deception. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese Northern Force. It had no real chance of success. Ozawa's force included 4 Japanese carriers, but these were not the sleek, efficient warships that had dominated the Pacific in earlier years. These were remnants, ghosts of the once mighty Japanese carrier fleet. The carriers carried only 108 aircraft total. The American carriers at Leyte carried more than 1,500. Ozawa knew this. Ozawa knew that his force was bait. Beautiful bait, enticing bait. A lure designed to draw Admiral Halsey's carriers north, away from Leyte Gulf. Ozawa's orders were clear. He would sacrifice himself and his ships to clear the way for the battleships. This was not a battle plan. This was a death sentence. But the Japanese Navy had decided that a death sentence was acceptable if it accomplished the strategic objective. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force. 23 major warships, including the Yamato and the Musashi. Kurita was not enthusiastic about the plan. Kurita understood the mathematics. He understood that the Japanese Navy was outnumbered. He understood that without adequate air cover, a surface fleet could not survive. But Kurita also understood that when the emperor issued orders, they must be obeyed. Kurita understood that the military hierarchy could not tolerate dissent. So Kurita prepared his force for battle. He distributed the ships so that if they were attacked from the air, the losses would be spread across multiple vessels. He calculated the fuel consumption and the speed requirements. He determined which route would provide the most protection and the quickest passage through Leyte Gulf. And then he ordered the fleet to sail. The Southern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura and Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima, would approach Leyte Gulf from the south through Surigao Strait. The center and northern forces would approach from the north and west. The plan was for all three forces to converge on Leyte Gulf simultaneously and destroy the American transport fleet before Halsey's carriers could return. It was a bold plan. It was a desperate plan. But it was a plan that had been approved by the Emperor himself. So on October 23, 1944, the Japanese fleet sailed. Vice Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet was not designed for fleet combat. The 7th Fleet was designed to support amphibious landings. It carried transport ships. It carried cargo vessels. It carried minesweepers and net tenders and hospital ships. Kinkaid had some battleships, 6 old battleships, most of them survivors of Pearl Harbor. He had cruisers and destroyers. But his primary mission was not to fight battleships. His primary mission was to protect the landing force, to maintain supply lines, to provide fire support for troops ashore. The fast carriers were with Halsey and the 3rd Fleet. Kinkaid's carrier force consisted of what he called the baby flat tops. 18 escort carriers, each one slower than the last. These were small ships displacing about 11,000 tons. They carried a handful of aircraft each. The aircraft were Wildcats and Avengers, reliable planes but not as powerful as the fighters and torpedo bombers carried by the fast carriers. Kinkaid's crew knew they were the forgotten fleet. They had supported every amphibious operation in the Southwest Pacific. They had fired naval gunfire support for dozens of Marine and Army landings. But when the glory came, when the decisive naval battles were fought, they were left behind. Their mission was logistics. Their role was unglamorous. Their reward was obscurity. And now, on October 25, 1944, that obscurity was about to be shattered in the most dramatic way imaginable. The morning of October 25 began like any other morning in the Gulf. The 7th Fleet escort carriers were operating in 3 groups. Taffy 1, under Rear Admiral Thomas L. Sprague, was the southernmost group. Taffy 2, under Rear Admiral Felix B. Stump, was in the middle. Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton A. F. Sprague, was the northernmost, positioned close to the exit of San Bernardino Strait. The ships were conducting routine operations. Launch aircraft for dawn patrol missions. Coordinate with ground forces for the day's fire support missions. Monitor radio frequencies for enemy contact. Routine, entirely routine. At 06:37 on the morning of October 25th, an aircraft from Taffy 3 reported enemy ships approaching from the northwest. The report was not terribly alarming. There were often Japanese ships in the area. The enemy was always attempting something. But this report soon became more specific. The pilot reported seeing not just cruisers or destroyers, but battleships. Large battleships. The largest warships in the world. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, received the message and initially did not believe it. It was impossible. Impossible that there could be Japanese battleships here. Impossible that Halsey would have left San Bernardino Strait undefended. Impossible that the 7th Fleet would suddenly be facing the main Japanese battle fleet. But as the reports continued to arrive, the truth became unavoidable. The Japanese were here. The Japanese were attacking. And Kinkaid's escort carriers were going to have to do something about it. The Japanese center force had not been destroyed. The American aircraft had damaged it, yes. The flagship Musashi had been sunk by a devastating attack by American dive bombers and torpedo bombers. The Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, had been struck by 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before finally giving up the ghost and sliding beneath the waves. It was one of the most dramatic kills of the entire war. A ship the size of a small mountain sinking. The Yamato had been damaged. Other ships had been damaged. But the force had not been stopped. Kurita had reversed course when the first wave of American attacks had begun, trying to avoid the worst of the storm. But then he had turned back around. The orders from Tokyo were clear. Push through. Attack the beachhead. Win or die trying. So Kurita pushed through San Bernardino Strait in the darkness. No American ship challenged him. No American surface force blocked his passage. The Americans who should have been there were somewhere else. Halsey was north, pursuing the Japanese northern force, and Kurita was slipping through an open gate into American waters. Clifton Sprague made a decision that would become legendary in naval history. He decided not to run. He had slow ships. His ships could only make 17 knots. The Japanese force included battleships that could make 20 knots or better. Running would not save him. His ships would be caught from behind, sunk while attempting to flee. Instead, Sprague made the calculated decision to fight. He would not try to win. Such a thing was impossible. But he could slow the Japanese down. He could divert them from the transports. He could give the other escort carriers time to move south and away. He could buy time for help to arrive. And so Sprague ordered Taffy 3 to launch all available aircraft. He ordered his escort destroyers to lay down a smokescreen. He ordered his force to turn to the east and open the range from the Japanese fleet. And he began what would become one of the most audacious defenses in naval history. The aircraft from Taffy 3 were not heavily armed. The Wildcats carried machine guns. The Avengers carried a single torpedo each or small bombs. These weapons were designed to fight submarines and provide close air support to ground troops. They were not designed to fight battleships. Against a battleship like the Yamato, a machine gun was no more effective than a pea shooter. A 500-pound bomb would make a dent in the armor, nothing more. A single torpedo might damage the ship, but it would require many torpedoes to sink something so large and so heavily armored. But the aircraft kept attacking, again and again, making passes at the Japanese fleet, firing their weapons, scoring hits where they could, drawing enemy fire. Some of the aircraft were shot down, some of the pilots were killed. But the attacks continued, because that was the mission, to disrupt the enemy, to prevent them from reaching the transports. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 made torpedo attacks on the Japanese battleships. The destroyer Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, launched 5 torpedoes at the battleship Congo. The torpedoes streaked across the water, leaving white trails in the blue ocean. One of the torpedoes hit. It tore into the battleship's hull. It did not sink the Congo, but it was a hit. A direct hit by a torpedo fired from a destroyer against a battleship. It was a moment that would echo through naval history. Evans, a Cherokee Indian who had enlisted in the Navy, was displaying a level of courage that seemed almost reckless. But that was what was required. Recklessness. Audacity. The willingness to attack a much larger force in the knowledge that the attack might fail. The destroyers Hole and Heermann followed suit, launching their own torpedoes, making their own attacks. The entire screen was determined to buy time, to slow down the Japanese fleet. The Japanese were confused. Admiral Kurita, commanding the center force, was not certain what he was facing. His ships were reporting enemy aircraft and enemy ships. The radio was filled with contact reports and damage reports. The American escort carriers had dispersed to make themselves smaller targets. The screen of destroyers was making repeated attacks. The entire scene was chaos. And in the midst of the chaos, Kurita made a critical decision. He assumed that the escort carriers were actually full-sized fleet carriers. He assumed that Halsey's main carrier force was nearby. He assumed that he was about to be surrounded by American carriers. Based on these assumptions, all of them incorrect, Kurita ordered his fleet to begin withdrawing, to regroup, to reassess the situation, to wait for his forces to consolidate. It was a decision that would change the course of the Pacific War. In the larger context of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the actions of Taffy 3 have sometimes been overshadowed by other events. Admiral Oldendorf's victory at the Battle of Surigao Strait the night before was more clear-cut. Oldendorf had arranged his battleships and cruisers in a classic formation across the strait. When the Japanese southern force appeared, Oldendorf crossed the T, a maneuver that meant the Japanese ships could only fire their guns from the bow, while the American ships could fire their entire broadside. It was a slaughter. The Japanese battleships Fuso and Yamashiro were sunk. Japanese Admiral Nishimura was killed. It was a classic naval victory, clean, decisive, the kind of battle that military academies would study for decades. But what happened at Samar was different. It was not clean. It was not decisive in the traditional sense. It was desperate. It was improvisational. It was a battle between ships that should never have been facing each other. The escort carriers had no business fighting battleships. Yet they did. And in doing so, they bought time. They prevented Kurita from reaching the transports. They saved thousands of lives. The human element of the battle cannot be ignored. These were men, young men mostly, men who had volunteered or been drafted to serve their country, men who had trained on ships and in aircraft, men who had families back home, men who had dreams of what they would do after the war ended. Some of them would have wives they had left behind. Some of them had children they had never met. Some of them had joined the Navy hoping for adventure and glory. Instead, they found themselves in one of the most terrifying situations imaginable. They found themselves outgunned and outmatched, fighting against ships with guns bigger than their entire vessel. Consider the perspective of a young sailor aboard the USS Gambier Bay, one of the escort carriers that would be sunk during the battle. This sailor would have been perhaps 18 or 19 years old. He might have been a gun captain, responsible for manning one of the small guns on the ship's exterior. He would have known the limitations of his weapon. He would have known that his gun could not penetrate the armor of a Japanese battleship. He would have fired anyway, because that was the order, because that was his duty. When the shells from the Japanese battleship started hitting his ship, he would have felt the impact. He would have heard the sound of metal tearing. He would have seen fires start on the flight deck. He would have known that his ship was dying. The order to abandon ship would have come, and he would have climbed into the water. He would have joined hundreds of other sailors in the warm ocean. And he would have waited, and waited. For 3 days and 2 nights, the survivors of Taffy 3 would float in the water, waiting for rescue. In that time, the water would take its toll. The salt water would burn the eyes and the skin. The hunger and thirst would become overwhelming. Some of the sailors would be attacked by sharks. Some would die from their injuries. Some would simply give up and slip beneath the waves. It took 3 days before the rescue ships could reach them. 3 days of hell in the water. But why did they fight? Why did Clifton Sprague order his ships to attack instead of fleeing? Why did the destroyer captains order their ships to launch torpedoes against battleships? Why did the aircraft continue to attack even when they knew their weapons were inadequate? The answer lies in the nature of military command and human courage. Sprague understood that running would not save him. Sprague understood that his transports were the priority. Sprague understood that if he could slow the Japanese down, if he could keep them occupied and confused, then the transports would survive. And if the transports survived, then the landing would succeed. And if the landing succeeded, then the entire Pacific campaign would advance. Sprague's decision was not the result of recklessness. It was the result of cold calculation. It was the result of understanding that sometimes the only way to survive is to fight. The contrast between the American and Japanese perspectives on this battle is striking. The Americans were fighting to protect their fellow soldiers and sailors. The Americans were fighting to maintain the supply lines that kept an army fighting. The Americans were fighting because their mission was to support MacArthur's landing. They were not fighting for glory or honor in the abstract sense. They were fighting for the survival of their comrades. The Japanese, by contrast, were fighting because they had been ordered to fight. The Japanese Navy had calculated that the sacrifice of ships and men was acceptable if it could slow down the American advance. The Japanese had accepted in advance that they would lose most of their fleet. The Japanese had ordered their admirals to fight to the last man. Vice Admiral Kurita had been given orders to push through to Leyte Gulf and attack the transports. Kurita had understood that this was likely a suicide mission, but he had also understood that the orders came from Tokyo. The Emperor had approved the operation. The Chief of Naval Operations had ordered it. Kurita had to obey. The cultural difference between America and Japan revealed itself in these orders and in these responses. America placed value on the lives of its sailors. America wanted to win battles while preserving as many lives as possible. America preferred to use material resources rather than human resources when possible. This philosophy was reflected in the equipment the American Navy carried. American ships had better armor. American ships had better damage control systems. American sailors had better training in survival techniques. American medicine had better antibiotics and better surgical techniques. When an American sailor was wounded, he received medical care. When a Japanese sailor was wounded, he often received nothing. By 1944, the Japanese Navy was so short of medical supplies that wounded Japanese sailors on some ships were simply thrown overboard to die rather than consuming limited resources. This material abundance was itself a form of military advantage. The Americans could afford to send ships into battle knowing that if they were damaged, the damage control parties would be well-trained and well-equipped to repair the damage. The Americans could afford to have redundant systems on their ships so that if one system failed, another could take over. The Japanese, by contrast, were trying to do more with less. The Japanese were trying to win battles with inferior equipment and inadequate resources. The battle raged for hours. Aircraft continued to attack the Japanese fleet. Destroyers continued to make torpedo runs. The escort carriers continued to launch whatever aircraft they could get airborne. The Japanese kept shooting. Shells from the 18-inch guns of the Yamato splashed into the water near the American ships, sending up geysers of spray. Shells from the 6-inch and 8-inch guns of the Japanese cruisers raked across the escort carriers, starting fires, tearing holes in the superstructure. The escort carrier St. Lo took a hit below the waterline. The escort carrier White Plains was hit repeatedly but somehow remained afloat. The destroyer Hull was hit so many times that it seemed impossible she could still be floating. And yet, through it all, the American ships kept fighting. Then, at approximately 09:11 in the morning, Admiral Kurita ordered his fleet to break off the attack and withdraw. Kurita believed that he was facing a much larger American force than was actually present. Kurita believed that help must be on the way. Kurita believed that the risk of losing more ships was not worth the potential gain. And so Kurita ordered the retreat. The Japanese fleet turned around and headed back toward San Bernardino Strait. They would not reach Leyte Gulf. They would not bombard the transports. They would not disrupt the landing. They would not achieve their objective. The battle off Samar lasted approximately 2 hours. In those 2 hours, the escort carriers of Taffy III had faced the most powerful battleships in the world and had prevailed. It was not a victory in the traditional sense. The American ships had suffered significant damage. 3 escort carriers had been sunk, along with 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. Nearly 2,100 American sailors had been killed. But the transports had been saved. The landing had succeeded. The mission had been accomplished. There was another element to the battle that would distinguish it in history. On the morning of October 25, 1944, the Japanese launched the first organized kamikaze attack of the war. The USS St. Lo, one of the escort carriers that had survived the surface action with Taffy III, was attacked by a Japanese aircraft that had been deliberately modified to carry explosives. The pilot, Lieutenant Yukio Seki, flew his aircraft directly into the escort carrier, deliberately crashing into the flight deck. The impact and the explosion that followed caused massive damage to the St. Lo. Fires broke out. The damage could not be controlled. Within 30 minutes of the kamikaze impact, the St. Lo sank. She became the first major American ship to be deliberately sunk by a kamikaze attack. Across the Atlantic, in the European theater, the Germans had heard about the American and British naval victories in the Pacific. German admirals had wondered how they could compete with American industrial might and American courage. But the Germans did not have the answer that the Japanese were beginning to implement. The Germans did not have pilots who were willing to die to sink ships. The Japanese did. And on October 25, 1944, that willingness began to change the nature of the naval war. The larger Battle of Leyte Gulf encompassed all of these elements: the victory of Admiral Oldendorf at Surigao Strait, the desperate defense of Taffy III at Samar, the pursuit of the Japanese northern force by Admiral Halsey to the north, and the first organized kamikaze attack. It was the largest naval battle in history, with more than 200,000 naval personnel engaged. The American Navy lost approximately 3,500 men killed and 1,189 men wounded. The Japanese Navy lost approximately 2,500 men killed and an uncounted number of wounded. Most importantly, the Japanese Navy never recovered from the losses sustained at Leyte Gulf. Ships could be replaced. Training programs could develop new pilots. But trained officers and experienced sailors could not be quickly replaced. The cream of the Japanese officer corps had been killed at Leyte Gulf. The experienced sailors who had fought through years of war were gone. What remained was a Japanese Navy that was a hollow shell of what it had once been. The strategic implications of Leyte Gulf were enormous. The landing at Leyte succeeded. MacArthur was able to continue his advance toward the Philippines. The Japanese were unable to stop the American drive westward across the Pacific. The Philippines would be secured by the spring of 1945. Luzon would fall. Manila would be liberated, and the base would be established for the invasion of Japan itself. None of this would have been possible if Kurita's center force had reached Leyte Gulf. If the transports had been sunk, if the landing had been disrupted, the entire timetable of the Pacific War would have been different. What made the victory of Taffy 3 possible? What was it that allowed a handful of lightly armed escort carriers to defeat a force of heavy battleships and cruisers? The first element was courage. The sailors and officers of Taffy 3 were not reckless. They were brave. They understood the odds they were facing. They understood that they might die. But they also understood that their sacrifice might mean the difference between victory and defeat. That understanding gave them the will to fight. The second element was training. The crews of the escort carriers were well trained. They had participated in dozens of amphibious operations. They understood how to manage their ships under stress. They understood how to coordinate with each other. They understood the limitations and the capabilities of their vessels. The Japanese, by contrast, were operating with crews that had been decimated by losses in previous battles. The Japanese sailors were brave, but they were also inexperienced. The coordination between Japanese ships was poor. The communication between commanders was slow and sometimes garbled. By 1944, the American Navy had developed sophisticated communication procedures and coordination protocols that allowed ships to work together as a unified force. The Japanese Navy, crippled by losses and by the destruction of its most experienced officers and men, did not have these capabilities. The third element was luck. Pure dumb luck. At one critical moment, the Japanese cruiser Kumano, attacking one of the escort carriers, took a torpedo hit that severed her bow. For a moment, the cruiser was out of the action. At another moment, Kurita's flagstaff issued conflicting orders that created confusion among the Japanese ships. At another moment, an American pilot managed to score a torpedo hit on the Yamato that caused damage, that forced the battleship to withdraw from the action temporarily. These moments of luck, accumulated over the course of a 2-hour battle, made the difference between American victory and American defeat. The fourth element was American industrial capacity and material resources. By 1944, American factories were producing ships, aircraft, and weapons faster than any other nation in the world. The Americans could afford to lose ships and replace them with new ships. The Americans could afford to equip all of their sailors with the best available training and equipment. The American Navy could afford to keep redundant systems aboard ships so that damage could be controlled and repaired. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, was trying to do more with less. The Japanese were trying to maintain a world-spanning empire with decreasing resources. The mathematics simply did not work. Eventually, the material disadvantage would prove insurmountable. Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid, commanding the 7th Fleet, received commendations for his role in the battle. He had made the correct decision to place Oldendorf's battleships and cruisers in position to guard Surigao Strait. He had prepared his escort carriers to provide close air support and anti-submarine defense. He had maintained communication and coordination with the forces under his command. But Kinkaid had also been badly served by the division of command between himself and Admiral Halsey. Kinkaid had made assumptions about Halsey's actions based on ambiguous radio messages. Kinkaid had assumed that Halsey was leaving a force to guard San Bernardino Strait. These assumptions had turned out to be incorrect. The communication between the two admirals had been poor. The lack of a unified command structure in the Pacific had nearly resulted in disaster. After the war, there would be considerable debate about whether Halsey had made the correct decision to pursue the Japanese northern force and leave San Bernardino Strait undefended. Admiral William F. Halsey, commanding the 3rd Fleet, had made what he believed to be the correct tactical decision. Halsey had been ordered to engage and defeat the Japanese fleet. Halsey believed that the main Japanese fleet was the northern force with its carriers. Halsey believed that if he destroyed the northern force, the battle would be decided. Halsey did not fully believe that Kurita's center force would actually press through to attack the beachhead. Halsey believed that air attacks had sufficiently damaged the center force that it would turn back. Halsey was wrong, but Halsey was not alone in making this incorrect assessment. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had also believed that Kurita would turn back. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, had also believed this. The consensus opinion among American commanders was that a surface fleet without air cover, could not survive in the face of superior enemy air power. This belief was rooted in the lessons of battles fought earlier in the war. At the Battle of the Java Sea in 1942, a Dutch cruiser force had been destroyed by Japanese surface ships while lacking adequate air cover. At the Battle of Savo Island in 1942, American cruisers had been ambushed by Japanese cruisers and suffered a devastating defeat, in part because American air forces were not available to provide support. The conventional wisdom was that surface fleets without air cover were vulnerable. Kurita's center force appeared to be exactly such a fleet. How could it survive? How could it penetrate all the way to Leyte Gulf without being completely destroyed? What the American commanders did not fully appreciate was that Kurita was willing to accept massive losses in order to accomplish his objective. What the American commanders did not fully appreciate was that the Japanese Navy had calculated that even a severely damaged force of battleships and cruisers could inflict significant damage on the American transports. What the American commanders did not fully appreciate was that Kurita was operating under standing orders from Tokyo that essentially required him to attack regardless of the odds. Vice Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, understood these factors. Sprague understood that Kurita might actually try to fight through to Leyte Gulf. Sprague understood that the escort carriers might be all that stood between the transports and a Japanese attack. Sprague understood that his mission was to slow down the Japanese to buy time to prevent them from reaching the transports. Sprague understood this because Sprague had read his orders. Sprague understood his mission. Sprague understood the strategic importance of the Leyte landing. And so when the Japanese appeared on the horizon, Sprague made the decision to fight. There is a recurring theme in military history about the moment when officers must make difficult decisions. The decisions that might mean the difference between survival and destruction. The decisions that might mean the difference between victory and defeat. These moments reveal the character of the officer. They reveal what the officer truly believes about duty and honor and responsibility. Clifton Sprague made a decision that revealed his character. He decided that his mission was more important than his own safety. He decided that the survival of the escort carriers was less important than the survival of the transport ships. He decided that his sailors would have to fight even though the odds were against them. This decision was not made in isolation. Kincaid had given Sprague the orders to conduct airstrikes against the landing beaches on the morning of October 25. Kincaid had positioned Taffy 3 in the northern position closest to San Bernardino Strait. These orders and this positioning reflected an understanding that something might happen, that the Japanese might attempt an attack, that the escort carriers might need to respond. When the Japanese appeared, Sprague was able to respond quickly because he had been positioned with the expectation that such a response might be necessary. The larger lesson of Leyte Gulf is about the importance of preparation and positioning. The American Navy did not defeat the Japanese Navy because of luck, although luck played a role. The American Navy defeated the Japanese Navy because the American commanders had thought through the possibilities, because the American commanders had positioned their forces to address multiple scenarios, because the American commanders had given their subordinates the mission and the resources necessary to carry out that mission. Conversely, the Japanese Navy failed at Leyte Gulf not because the plan was inherently flawed, although it was extremely complex and ambitious. The Japanese Navy failed because the plan required perfect execution. The plan required all three Japanese forces to arrive at Leyte Gulf at approximately the same time. The plan required the deception of the northern force to work perfectly. The plan required the American commanders to respond exactly as the Japanese had predicted. When one element of the plan failed, when Admiral Kurita lost his nerve and ordered a retreat, the entire plan collapsed. A less ambitious plan, a more modest objective, might have had a better chance of success, but the Japanese had decided that a dramatic victory was necessary. The Japanese had decided that everything would be risked on the attempt, and when the attempt failed, the Japanese Navy was broken. The aftermath of Leyte Gulf saw the Japanese Navy withdraw to Japanese home waters. The Japanese Navy would launch kamikaze attacks against American ships. The Japanese Navy would lose more ships and more men. But the Japanese Navy would never again attempt a major surface action. The age of battleship warfare was over. The Japanese had learned too late the lesson that the Americans had learned years earlier. In the modern naval war, Aircraft were the primary weapon. Surface ships were useful, but they were secondary. A surface fleet without adequate air cover could not survive. By October 1944, both the American Navy and the Japanese Navy understood this, but understanding and implementing were two different things. The Americans had implemented the lesson. The Japanese, crippled by losses and by the destruction of their carrier force, could not implement the lesson. So the Japanese lost. The story of Taffy 3 has become legendary in American naval history. School children learn about Clifton Sprague and the escort carriers that fought the battleships. Naval officers study the battle as a model of how to fight when outnumbered and outgunned. Historians cite the battle as an example of American courage and determination. All of this is justified. The sailors and officers of Taffy 3 displayed extraordinary courage. They fought against impossible odds. They defeated a much larger enemy force. They sacrificed themselves to accomplish their mission. They deserve to be remembered and honored. But it is also important to understand the larger context. Taffy 3 was part of a larger battle. Taffy 3 was part of a larger strategy. The defense of Leyte Gulf was not decided by the courage of the escort carrier pilots alone. It was decided by the combination of many factors. The defense of Surigao Strait by Admiral Oldendorf prevented the southern force from reaching Leyte Gulf. The pursuit of the northern force by Admiral Halsey prevented that force from providing air support to Kurita's center force. The positioning of the escort carriers by Admiral Kincaid ensured that they were available to respond to the Japanese attack. The training and preparation of the American Navy ensured that the response would be effective. The material resources of the American Navy ensured that even damaged ships could be repaired and returned to service. All of these factors working together created the conditions for an American victory. The Japanese faced a fundamental problem that no amount of courage or determination could overcome. The Japanese were trying to preserve an empire that had already been lost. The Japanese were trying to defend the Philippines while simultaneously being unable to provide adequate air cover or logistical support to their forces in the Philippines. The Japanese were trying to maintain control of an empire that stretched across millions of square miles of ocean, while the American Navy was growing stronger every day. The mathematics of the war were against Japan. By October 1944, it was clear to any rational observer that Japan could not win the war. The only question was how long Japan would resist before surrendering. The answer to that question would not be determined at Leyte Gulf, but at Leyte Gulf the course of the war was set. The American advance would continue. The Philippines would be liberated. The Japanese home islands would be invaded, and Japan would surrender. The symbolic element of the battle cannot be overlooked. The small escort carriers, crewed by American sailors who had volunteered or been drafted into service, fought against the most powerful battleships in the world. The Yamato and the Musashi represented Japanese power and industrial might. The escort carriers represented American determination and courage. In the end, determination and courage prevailed over raw power. The escort carriers did not sink the battleships, but the escort carriers prevented the battleships from accomplishing their mission. And in naval warfare, preventing the enemy from accomplishing their mission is a form of victory. There is also the element of coffee. Coffee was not specifically a symbol of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but it was a symbol of the larger war. American sailors had coffee when they were at sea. They had coffee when they were waiting for battle. They had coffee when they were recovering from battle. Coffee was a comfort. Coffee was a reminder of home. Coffee was a luxury that most Japanese sailors did not have. By October 1944, Japanese sailors were rationed to meager rations of rice and salt fish. They were starving. They were diseased. They were worn down by years of war. American sailors, by contrast, had sufficient food. American sailors had medical care. American sailors had the sense that their government valued their lives. This material difference was reflected in the outcome of the battle. The well-fed, well-cared-for American sailors fought with more effectiveness than the starving, poorly cared-for Japanese sailors. The battle off Samar is sometimes referred to as a tactical victory for the Japanese. The Japanese sank or damaged several American ships. The Japanese inflicted casualties on the American Navy. From a strictly tactical perspective, the Japanese performed well. But from a strategic perspective, it was an American victory. The American transports were saved. The Leyte landing succeeded. The American advance continued. The war moved closer to its inevitable conclusion. In the end, the story of Taffy 3 and the Battle of Leyte Gulf is a story about the nature of war and the nature of courage. It is a story about what happens when brave men are forced to make impossible decisions. It is a story about the triumph of preparation and training over raw power. It is a story about the importance of logistics and material resources in modern warfare. It is a story about the clash between two great powers, each with different strengths and different weaknesses. And most importantly, it is a story about the American Navy and the American sailors who fought and died to protect their country and their comrades. October 26, 1944 arrived as the final day of the battle. The Japanese fleet had withdrawn through San Bernardino Strait. The transports had been saved. MacArthur remained ashore, continuing his offensive against the Japanese. The Leyte landing would succeed. The Philippines would be liberated, and the war would move forward toward Japan and eventual American victory. But the cost had been high. The cost would continue to be high until the war ended. But on this morning in October 1944, the American Navy had proven that it could overcome any obstacle, that it could triumph over any enemy, that it could accomplish any mission. The story of the escort carriers that fought the battleships has been told and retold. It has become part of American naval legend. It has been the subject of books and documentaries and films. It has been studied in military academies. It has been analyzed by historians and strategists. And yet the story never grows old. Because the story represents something timeless about the human spirit. It represents the capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. It represents the power of courage and determination to overcome adversity. It represents the triumph of the human will over the forces arrayed against it. In the aftermath of Leyte Gulf, the American Navy would continue its advance toward Japan. The escort carriers would continue to support amphibious landings. The fast carriers would continue to provide air support and reconnaissance. The battleships would continue to bombard enemy positions. And the submarines would continue to sink Japanese cargo ships and warships. The war would continue for almost a year more. Many more American sailors would be killed. Many more ships would be sunk. But the outcome was never again in doubt. After Leyte Gulf, American victory was assured. The philosophical element of Taffy 3's victory is profound. The escort carriers represented an idea, the idea that ordinary people, given the right leadership and the right training and the right equipment, could accomplish extraordinary things. The idea that courage and determination could overcome superior force. The idea that fighting for a righteous cause, the defense of democracy and freedom, was worth any sacrifice. These ideas, American ideas, proved stronger than the Japanese ideas of sacrifice and death for the emperor. These ideas, American ideas, proved stronger than German ideas of racial superiority and totalitarian control. In the end, the idea of freedom proved stronger than the idea of authoritarian power. And the Battle of Leyte Gulf was one of the crucial moments when this idea was demonstrated and proven. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, with Taffy 3's defense at its center, represents a turning point not just in the war but in human history. It represents the moment when the old world order, the empire-based hierarchical authoritarian world, began to give way to a new world order based on democracy and individual liberty. It represents the moment when the United States Navy, built on principles of professionalism and individual courage, defeated the Japanese Navy, built on principles of sacrifice and unquestioning obedience. It represents the moment when the superior material resources and the superior training and preparation of the American forces proved decisive against the courage and determination of the Japanese forces. And so the story of Taffy 3 endures. The story of the escort carriers that fought the battleships. The story of Admiral Clifton Sprague making the decision to fight rather than flee. The story of the destroyer captains ordering their ships to attack ships 10 times their size. The story of the young sailors manning the guns, knowing that their weapons could not penetrate enemy armor, but firing anyway. The story of the aircraft pilots making repeated bombing and torpedo runs against a heavily defended enemy force. The story of all these men, acting together, achieving something that should have been impossible. The story of how freedom and courage triumph over oppression and fear. The story of an American victory in the Pacific that changed the course of human history. The story of October 25, 1944, the day that the escort carriers did what Japan thought was impossible, and in doing so, ensured that democracy would survive and that freedom would endure.